Having been using Emacs for about 3 months or so now, one question keeps coming up again and again from viewers of the channel, and they keep asking me which one is better, Vim or Emacs. Well, that's a tricky topic, but I think it's one we should go ahead and try to tackle today. I think the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that Vim and Emacs are not really the same thing. Vim and Emacs are two totally different kinds of programs. It's really comparing apples to oranges when people try to compare Vim to Emacs. Vim is a text editor, and it's a damn good text editor. It's a great text editor. Emacs is really a programming platform or a development environment, right? It just happens to ship also with a text editor, but it's not really a text editor. Emacs is much, much more than just a text editor. So let's talk a little bit of history first about these two text editors, how they got started. Vim was first released back in 1991, so it's been around for a long time. But Vim is actually a direct descendant of a much older text editor called VI. VI was first released back in, I think, the mid-1970s, around 1976. A man named Bill Joy created VI for the old Unix operating system. Vim's creator is a man named Bram Molinar. Again, he released Vim initially back in 1991, and Vim stands for VI Improved. That's how Vim got its name. It's basically a better version of VI. And of course, Vim is free and open source software. It's licensed under a free license. It's actually a charityware license because the creator of Vim encourages the users of that text editor to consider donating to children in Uganda. Vim is intended to be a fast, readily available, extremely versatile text editor that comes pre-installed on pretty much every Unix-based operating system on the planet, including most of your Linux distributions. And because it's available on pretty much every Linux distribution out of the box, it really pays off to know the basics of Vim. Whether you are going to be a Vim user or not, you need to know some of the fundamentals of using Vim. If you work with Linux, BSD, macOS, these Unix-based operating systems a lot, it's a really good idea to have a working knowledge of Vim. Now, Emacs has been around also since the mid-70s, around 1976. Emacs stands for Editor Macros. That is what Emacs stands for. The version of Emacs most people are familiar with is, of course, GNU Emacs, which was created by none other than Richard Stallman himself, who is the founder of the GNU project and the free software movement. Just like Vim, Emacs runs basically on every operating system known to man. You can install Emacs on Linux and BSD and Mac and Windows. However, because Emacs is a rather large piece of software, it usually doesn't come pre-installed. So on your Linux distros, almost every Linux distribution, all of them ship with VI, most of them ship with Vim. Very, very few Linux distributions ship with Emacs already installed out of the box. So don't expect Emacs just to be on every machine. So if you're an Emacs guy, again, might be a good idea to know a little Vim because Vim will always be there. So already we get into some of the reasons why you might choose Vim over Emacs. Vim's already pre-installed. Emacs is a large program. Some might say Emacs is bloated, but don't jump to that conclusion too quickly. You know, I like to rail against bloated programs a lot, but you got to understand something here. Emacs is bloated, I guess, if you're comparing it to other text editors, but remember, Emacs is not a text editor. The reason Emacs is large really has everything to do with the fact that it's much closer to an operating system than a text editor. So Emacs, it features a Turing complete programming language, Emacs Lisp, eLisp, which really makes it possible to customize and extend Emacs in ways that really, like mentally, you would have trouble comprehending everything you could do with Emacs. It's that powerful. So Emacs is not just a text editor, it's really a Lisp interpreter. It's also a shell. Actually, it's multiple shells are inside Emacs by default. It's a browser. It's a Git client. It's an email client. Heck, the other day I came across a video editor plugin for Emacs. Can you imagine that? You can actually edit video within Emacs. Obviously, these are things that you normally couldn't dream of doing in something like Vim, hence the difference in size. I think one thing we should do is kind of compare similar workflows in Emacs and Vim now that I've used both quite a bit. And, you know, you can do pretty much the same things in Vim as in Emacs and vice versa, but there are little differences. Why don't I switch over to my desktop here? And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and open up something. I'm going to open up my xmonad config here in Emacs. So this is my xmonad.hs file here. And you know what? Let me go ahead and open a terminal, and I will do the same thing in Vim here. So let me open up my xmonad.hs in Vim. Now we could talk about text editing, but honestly, text editing on Vim and on Emacs are pretty much the same thing. The one thing I will say where Vim really shines compared to Emacs, the key bindings. The default key bindings for Emacs are terrible, and they're actually dangerous because they're really tough on your hands. The constantly stretching of the pinky to hit Control and Alt and Escape. The fact that the key bindings are a little more complicated. They're typically 2 key bindings, not just 1 key binding. They're really key chords in Emacs for the default GNU Emacs. So I think what most people do and what I eventually did, I spent about a month learning the default GNU Emacs key bindings, but eventually I switched over to Evil mode, which basically turns Emacs into Vim. It uses all the Vim key bindings. It uses the Vim modes, you know, normal mode, insert mode, visual mode. Once you switch over to using the Vim key bindings in Emacs, text editing on Vim and text editing on Emacs is pretty much the same thing, so I won't discuss that. But where things get a little tricky is when you get outside of the text editor, because that's where Emacs is, you know, a completely different beast than Vim. For example, let's talk about our file managers within these particular text editors. Emacs has a built-in file manager called dired, D-I-R-E-D, which stands for Directory Editor. So here, my version of Emacs, by the way, is a distribution of Emacs called Doom Emacs. And to get to dired, I can either space period or space, either one works. And, you know, I get this little file manager here inside Emacs, and I can search for something, whatever it is I want to search for. If I want to search for my bash RC, I can search for it and hit enter, and it'll open it here in Emacs. Or if I wanted to just open a directory, I could just hit enter on a directory path, and I get the file manager, dired, here in Emacs. And, you know, I could search through the directory editor here. Vim has a built-in file manager as well, and to get to it, you need to do command mode, so colon, and then you need to type explore, capital E, explore, and hit enter. And it opens the directory that you're currently in. So I was in my xmonad directory because I was editing my xmonad config. But it's very similar to dired over in Emacs. You can navigate the directory structure. You can search. So if I, you know, hit a slash symbol, I can search for something. Maybe I want to, you know, cd into my wallpapers directory, or maybe I just want to get back into the xmonad directory, which I probably should go back into and go back to the file that I was in. So you do have built-in file managers in both Emacs, Doom Emacs especially, since that's the one I'm running, and in Vim. Now, although you do have built-in file managers in both Emacs and Vim, a lot of people in both Emacs and Vim also install third-party file managers, if you will. One very popular one in Vim is called NerdTree, and I have it installed in mine. It's one of the few plugins I have in my Vim config. I don't heavily edit really anything. I don't add a ton of plugins in either Vim or Emacs, but I do add NerdTree in Vim, and I have that set to Control N. And this opens NerdTree in Vim. Now in Emacs, you have various NerdTree-like plugins. One of them is called NeoTree, and I have that installed here in Doom Emacs. Actually, it's installed in Doom Emacs out of the box. So if I do space OP, it opens NeoTree here inside Doom Emacs. They function very similarly. You navigate the directory structure, you know, you can get into directories, subdirectories, and finally open the document that you want to work with. Let me close the NeoTree and the NerdTree. So in Doom Emacs, to close a frame, space WC for space window close. In Vim, you could do Control WC again for window close. let me show you one neat trick that Doom Emacs has I discovered the other day, which I thought was really neat, that you really don't have built into Vim. So you see the first 3 lines, actually the first 6 lines of this config are really just comments. In a Haskell documents, comments begin with the dash symbols, the 2 dashes, or sometimes several dashes if I want to create line breaks. And what if I want to uncomment these lines? Well, in Emacs, you can uncomment a line. Here in Doom Emacs anyway, the key binding is GCC. So if I do GCC, it uncomments that first line. You see that? Now if I did GCC again, it would comment it back out. How cool is that? And of course, you could give this a number of lines to uncomment or comment. So if I did 3 GCC, it uncomments those 3 lines, U for undo, of course. Or I could do, how about 6 GCC? And you see how cool that was? It uncommented the next lines, and it removed the entire line of dashes that was here, plus the 3 dashes that was in front of imports. That's really cool because it figures out how many dashes are in the comments, so it can be a variable amount of dashes that are commenting the lines, and Emacs is smart enough to get rid of them. Now, in Vim, I know of no way just to hit a key binding to comment a line or uncomment. Now, because Vim is extensible, you could script it in such a way that it could have some kind of functionality like that. It's beyond my abilities, but there's probably people that have worked something like that out. But in Vim, typically what you would do, the easiest way to uncomment or to comment a bunch of lines is to simply get into visual mode. So, if you did a Control V to get into visual block mode, and then you could just go over a couple of lines and then start going down, and then you could D, and you could delete everything. But the problem is, you see, I'm still left with the one random dash here. It's because visual block mode is not going, it's going to take away the same amount of hyphens or dashes. It's not going to handle a variable amount of them the way that Emacs command was. Now, there are some things I think Doom Emacs gets better than Vim. For example, say I want to open up a recently viewed file. I want to open up some recent document that I've played with, in the past couple of days. Well, in Doom Emacs, to view your recent files, all you need to do is space FR. And here's my recent file, so I could go and open anything. I won't bother opening anything. This is a little clunkier in Vim. So to view some recent files in Vim, you could do something like : and then browse old files. Hit enter. And you get a list of the last 100 files that you've played with, and you actually have to scroll to the bottom of the document. Eventually you'll get to 100. Once you're at 100, hit enter one more time. It asks you which number of the document do you actually want to edit. And just looking through some of these, I see number 77 as my i3 config. So if I hit 77, it would open up my i3 config. But that's certainly a little more clunky, a little more tedious than what Doom Emacs offers as far as just quickly opening up a recent file. Now, getting into some more general workflow stuff, I'm going to send my Vim document to a different workspace just so we have the whole screen taken up by Emacs for a second. Let's talk about some of the integration with all the other tools, because that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about Emacs. Let's talk about Git integration. And Emacs has a built-in Git client called Magit, M-A-G-I-T, and it is a really, really cool program, a really powerful program. So basically, just to show you a very easy example of me using Magit, I'm going to space to get back into dired, the directory editor, and I'm going to travel to my wallpapers directory and get into that. And then I'm going to Alt-X, and I'm going to go ahead and launch Magit. And by the way, there is a keyboard shortcut to launch Magit inside Doom Emacs. You can just simply type space GG, and then you don't have to worry about Alt-X and then typing Magit. Just space GG launches Magit. And since I have the Doom Emacs, the evil mode key bindings, J and K to go up and down, if I find something maybe that I want to stage here, I hit S for stage. And I just staged wallpapers number 275 and 276. And then for commit, or maybe I don't know the key bindings. Maybe I could type H for help and you can see there is a ton of stuff you can do in Git. Pretty much every command you can imagine as far as a Git command, and I'm not a Git master, so I would probably need to get help, help documentation on some of this. But for what I'm doing right now, I just want to do a simple commit. So I think just typing C and then C again, we get a commit. We need to type a commit message. I'm just going to type adding new wallpapers. And I'm going to do P to push, and where do we want to push it to? We're going to do origin master. Hit U. It's going to ask me, of course, for my GitLab username and then my GitLab password. Hit enter, and it says it's finished. If I open a browser, I'm sure we'd see that those wallpapers were pushed to my GitLab. Now switching back over to the workspace that I had Vim open on, obviously Vim's not going to have a built-in Git client. There may be some plugins out there. I think there are some Maggot-like plugins for Vim, but again, you got to go add them. You're going to have to configure them. They're not built in the way that Maggot was just built in to standard Emacs, GNU Emacs, or to my distribution, Doom Emacs. So if I want to, I want to push something to my GitLab, I actually have to open up a terminal, and, if I wanted to, well, I could do a quick one here. I could do a config, which is alias for my dot files, and add space -u. And if I do a config checkout, let's see, these are some of the files I have edited recently. I could do a config commit -m for message. I'm just going to say minor edits. And then, of course, we need to push it. And same thing, we got to do our username, password. And so, I don't use Git all the time. I mean, I push things every day, every other day, but it's not like I use Git all the time. So it's Maggot is not something that is a real deciding factor in whether I use Emacs over Vim, vice versa. The workflow is pretty much the same whether I pull up Maggot and do a quick push or just pull up a terminal and do a quick push. It's the same for me. But again, I am not a programmer by trade. I am not a developer. Those of you that are professional software developers, I can tell you, you're going to love Maggot. That may be the killer feature that makes you use something like Emacs over Vim. And really, that's kind of the big difference between the workflow if you're a Vim user and if you're an Emacs user is, if you're using Vim here, you're going to have to use other programs to do things like integrate with Git or check your email or play games or whatever it is you want to do, where Emacs, of course, has all that stuff built in. For example, if I'm a Vim user, can't use, a built-in email client in Vim. There may be some plugins available, I don't know, but I'm probably going to have to use a terminal-based email client like NeoMut. Let's see, I haven't actually used NeoMut in a while on my system, but it is still here. And if I switch over to Emacs, I don't have to open a terminal and use a separate program to check my email, because I can just check my email right here inside Emacs with MU4E and check my latest emails here, right here in Emacs. Now, if I wanted to get back to the buffer I was working in, which was my xmonad.hs, I just do space BB and get back to my xmonad config. And having played with NeoMut a lot over the years, and then just playing with MU4E for the last couple of months as an Emacs user, a rather new Emacs user, I can tell you MU4E is a nicer email client than NeoMut. It's easier to config. It looks better, feels better. It doesn't tend to crash on you all the time. You can have some weird things go on in NeoMut where really the tools that are built into Emacs are typically better than those terminal-based applications that you typically use if you're a Vim user. And just to throw out another example here, go back to the screen with Vim on it. If you're a Vim user, you're probably going to use if you need a terminal-based web browser, you guys know I love Lynx, Lynx. It's the oldest active web browser still in existence, and Lynx is great because it also has support for the Gopher protocol as well as your standard HTTP protocol. So if I open a terminal here and I type Lynx, we'll do https://distrotube.com and hit enter. This is my website here inside the Lynx browser, and I have Vim keys integrated, so I can J and K to go up and down. There are no images in Links, and I like that. Links also doesn't try to do any kind of formatting to try to format it like columns and everything, kind of like it would look in a proper web browser. It is very much text oriented, and that's why I really like Links. I think it's a fantastic terminal based web browser. Now, that being said, if I get back to Emacs here, Emacs has a built-in browser, and it's called EWW for, I think, Emacs Web something, I don't know, EWW. Hit enter. And then if I go to distrotube.com once again, this is distrotube.com and EWW. Let's make it a little bigger here. And, you know, this is, it does have images, but you can toggle the images on and off, actually. So I can get rid of the images if I don't want them. I probably would most of the time, because usually if I'm just looking for something, you know, inside a terminal or inside Emacs in this case, I probably don't need all the images. But anyway, it's a built-in browser, and it looks good. It really does, and I've played a little bit with EWW. I think it is perfectly okay as an alternative to things like Links and W3M and, you know, those other terminal-based web browsers that people use. Let me space WC to close that. Just speaking of terminals in general, I don't actually have to open up a terminal if I'm using Emacs the way I often have to do with Vim. Now you can run commands in both. You could just run a terminal, a shell command in Vim while you're running Vim, or run a shell command in Emacs, but sometimes you want to bring up a proper terminal. Well, in Emacs, what you can do is you can Alt-X, and then you can load one of the 3 or 4 built-in shells that are actually inside, at least Doom Emacs. Now, I added one called vterm, because it's really nice. It looks and feels like any other terminal. Obviously, ls works. Let me cd into the home directory. ls, you know what, clear the screen. I'm going to less, and I have this document in my home directory called emoji test. Let me hit enter, and this document is full of emojis. They don't actually display properly here. Now, that's because I didn't toggle on emoji mode. Let me toggle on emojify-mode and hit enter. I have emojis inside Emacs. How cool is that? For those of you that for some reason emoji support is a big thing, it's like a deal breaker for some people. I don't understand why you need emojis in a terminal or in your text editor or in Emacs. But for those of you that want it, Emacs handles emojis great. Now let me close my Emacs here, and I'm going to launch a terminal. This is my Alacrity terminal. Now, some of you guys, to switch to Emacs for your development environment, sometimes you're going to want to open something in Emacs and not Emacs the editor. Maybe all you want is DearEd, the file manager in Emacs, or one of the various shells in Emacs like the eShell or vterm. Maybe you just want to open up EWW, the browser, or EMMS, which is the multimedia player, your audio player inside Emacs. I should show you guys that too. But I could run a command like this, Emacs client, and then give it the C and E flags, and then, you know, in single quotes and in parentheses, vterm, and then in the line with an ampersand, and hit enter, and it will launch vterm in Emacs. Again, this is the vterm shell here, the one that I was just in a minute ago. If I do my standard tiling window manager key binding to close a window, it's going to ask me, do I really want to close this buffer because it's an Emacs buffer. That's the only problem is if you wanted to do something like that for your default terminal is closing it, you're always going to be asked, you know, do you really want to close it? Now, of course, you can configure it to never ask you those safety questions, but I'm not sure if you really want to run one of the Emacs shells as your default terminal, but if you wanted to, it's possible. Let me change vterm. Let's see if we can launch EMMS, which is the audio player inside Emacs. It just gave us the welcome screen. Let me just go ahead. I have to choose a directory for some music to play as part of the problem. So let me figure out what we want to load. And then I could start playing something here inside EMMS, here inside Emacs, if I wanted to play some music. And the track is playing just fine. Let me Alt-X and then EMMS space-stop. Of course, I could keybind that to something. It may already be a key binding. I just don't happen to know it offhand. So this was just showing you some of what you can do with both Vim and Emacs. Again, you can pretty much do whatever it is you can imagine in both Vim and Emacs. They're so extensible. They're really the only text editors that make sense. If you do a lot in a text editor, if you're a programmer or a developer, you do any kind of serious writing, actually, you deserve to actually take a look at Vim and Emacs. Those text editors are so powerful. Now, getting back to the editor wars, right? Which one's better? People are always going to ask you, which one's better? And since I've used both, people are asking me, which one's better? I don't know. That's like asking me, what's the best distro? What's the best car? Having used both, I can use both. I'm comfortable with both, and I like both. But let's talk about the differences again. I think Vim is a little more straightforward and easier to learn initially than Emacs. I think Vim is definitely the best text editor out of the box, especially Vim just blows away standard GNU Emacs as a text editor. Now, once you get evil mode installed and get your Vim key bindings and Vim modes in Emacs, it's a lot better. But Vim is definitely the better text editor. I think it's easier to learn. Emacs, though, it's much more powerful and probably far more extensible than even Vim. The fact that if you're willing to learn a little eLisp, you can do anything inside of Emacs. You can create plugins for anything inside of Emacs. And another thing we should talk about is Emacs is actually a GUI program. This is not Emacs in a terminal. This is a GUI. That's why you had images in that web browser, EWW, when I launched it in Emacs. That's why the emoji support is so fantastic, is this is a GUI where Vim has to run in a terminal. So whether you get the emoji support in Vim is not dependent on Vim, because Vim has to run in a terminal. The emoji support is dependent on whether the terminal that you're running Vim in has emoji support. So that is a real plus actually for Emacs, is the fact that it is a GUI program. One of the things I've noticed, though, the difference between Vim and Emacs users is there's a fundamental difference. When somebody says, I'm a Vim user, what they say is, I almost always use Vim as my text editor. That's basically all they're talking about. They're talking about, for a text editor, I use Vim if I'm a Vim user. It's completely different when somebody says, I'm an Emacs user, because they're not talking about, hey, I do all my text editing inside Emacs. That's not what they mean. They mean literally, they do everything inside of Emacs. An Emacs user is not talking about text editing. When somebody says, I use Emacs, they're talking about, I use the DearEd file manager, I use the eShell inside Emacs, I use Maggot, I use org mode, I use the web browser inside Emacs. They live inside Emacs. And again, I think that's why you're comparing apples to oranges when people try to compare Vim and Emacs. It's two completely different things. Now, if the Emacs way of doing things, really resonates with you, then I strongly suggest you give it a try. And if you want a nice pre-configured Emacs out of the box, obviously take a look at Doom Emacs. I've done a couple of videos on Doom Emacs here recently. Now, if you are one of those people that adhere to the Unix philosophy, do one thing well, then obviously Emacs, which tries to be a complete operating system unto itself, that's not the Unix philosophy. You probably want to be a Vim user, because Vim is just a text editor. If you want an email client, you go install an email client. You want a web browser, you go install a web browser. You don't live inside Vim. So again, what kind of person are you? I'll be honest, I'm more of the Unix philosophy kind of person. That's probably why I gravitated toward Vim initially. But the more I play with Emacs, the more I understand what Emacs is trying to accomplish. I got to admit, the more I like it. And if what you're really after is control and customization, then I think the path that Emacs has laid out is the one a lot of you guys probably want to be traveling on. So if you're one of those people, like my Vim RC is very simple. I don't have a million plugins. I have, maybe 8-10 plugins, and it's not a very customized Vim RC. I'm not one of those people that sit around and play with my config files all the time. Typically, I get something, and however it works out of the box, if I can make it work, I stick with it, and I try to edit as little as possible as far as my configs. But a lot of you guys, I've seen your Vim RCs. If you have 50 plus Vim plugins in your Vim RC, if your Vim RC is 2,000 lines. I've seen some of those VimRCs out there. Then, you know what? Maybe you guys are the ones that actually should consider Emacs, because if you're constantly editing that VimRC and tinkering with things and trying to learn Vim script and trying to create your own Vim plugins, I think you owe it to yourself to really take a look at Emacs. Now, before I go, I need to thank a few people. This episode was made possible by Chris, DJ, Donnie, Dylan, George, Haplo, Nate, Corbinian, Lambda, Michael, Mitchell, Rob, Sean, Stallman, and Willie. These guys, they're the producers of the show. Without these guys, this episode about Vim and Emacs, it wouldn't have been possible. The show's also brought to you by all these other names you're seeing on the screen right now. These guys, they help support my work over on Patreon. Sincere thank you to all these guys. Without these guys, this channel wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support the channel, consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. Alright guys, peace.